A very brief introduction from me. I just want to thank Amy O'Donnell and Sana Ojampera, and who's going to be Amy's respondent. With a kind of a personal note, because I've known Amy for like 4 or 5 years. When I got started up my PhD, she was the first person that I met in a collaborative project looking at interactive radio station, and she was working for Frontal SMS at the time, this program and group and collective that uses ways to collect SMS together for all variety of purposes. And I learned, and I was really glad to know that Amy, a couple of years ago, moved to Oxfam. And we were wondering, we wanted to have a kind of a cross pollination, mixing ideas between academia and practitioners. And I don't know, and we didn't really know if Oxfam was doing ICT stuff. And then, to my ignorance. And then I started talking with Amy, and Amy said, well, I can talk about this and that. We had like 10 minutes conversation just listing all the different projects that Oxfam is doing. And I know it's because of Amy that brought like her enthusiasm for ICTs into Oxfam, or Oxfam is sort of woke up to this. But we decided that, and we started discussing that one issue that is becoming increasingly important, not just for practitioner, but also for academic, is the sensitive use of data. We increasingly, for good reason, for academic, humanitarian purposes, we collect data, and sometimes we just don't have the time to reflect on what we are doing with this data. And if the idea is doing no harm, we might not do any harm in the immediate remit of a project, but we can leave a digital trace that can cause harms for other people. So we decided to have this kind of conversation between the practitioner on the one end, and Sana is going to offer the kind of academic answer to some of the question and raise some other issues that we face as academics. I told Amy that this is an informal group. I think some around the table are experts who have been reflecting on these issues. So the idea is like 15 minutes plus 10 minutes response. But if there is a burning question, just raise your hands and feel free to participate. And that's it.
That's great. Well, thank you so much for having me here. It's a real honour, and I find it really hard at my organisation to make data sound interesting. So it's actually surprised me how many of you have made the effort. So thank you so much for joining this conversation. And like Eugenio says, I think that we can learn so much from one another mutually, and there are increasingly blurry lines between what it means to be an academic and a practitioner. So I really look forward to this conversation. So I'll just give a quick introduction. Most of you know who Oxfam are. So we work with communities in over 90 countries to find innovative and practical solutions to overcome poverty. And those span right from immediate humanitarian relief through campaigns and advocacy work for influencing governments and service providers through to longer term livelihoods and development work. So if anyone's got any particular problems or questions about Oxfam, then let me know. And my role, as Eugenio hinted at, was to come to Oxfam and explore the enabling role that information communications technologies can play in our programme work. So that's not necessarily things like communication, country programmes having a blog or a Twitter feed, but really is about how those are embedded into some of our programmatic needs and objectives. So I think that's what's really critical is that we always see ICTs as an enabler. It's a means to an end, and we always try and work alongside country staff to figure out how there might be potential solutions to some of their problems. And this is just a bit of a picture of some of the things we've got going on at the moment. This is a cash distribution programme with which we've been working with Millicom in Guatemala to distribute electronic cash to vulnerable communities. This project is in Kenya and Ethiopia using mobile phones to monitor water points, to think about predicting trends around drought. This project here is in Somalia in very hard to reach communities, delivering polio and cholera prevention advice and coupling that with mobile phone based vouchers which can be exchanged for goods at local traders. We've been exploring at the bottom right some beneficiary management tools, so things like registrations, giving people photo ID cards, and on the top there's some increasing work around sort of social accountability, elections, and that particular one was from Mali a couple of years ago. So basically, the reason I've invited you to come and join me in this conversation is really to talk about this new concept of responsible data. We first started thinking about ethical data, but realised that focused a lot on the methodology, which there was already quite a lot of existing work around. And there's quite a popular movement at the moment. There's a group that convened by an organisation called the Engine Room. So responsible data is this terminology referred to this duty to ensure people's rights to consent, privacy, security and ownership around the information processes of collection, analysis, storage, presentation and then the reuse of data, at the same time respecting certain values of transparency and openness. So that's the basic premise. And at my organisation, people have very, very busy jobs and are very concerned about their own programme outcomes. So it's quite a task to convince people why this is important. So I like this diagram because it says, do you rely on information? Yes, then you work with data. Do you use a computer? Yes, then you work with data. Have you ever read anything at your work? Yes, okay, you work with data. And if no, then I don't believe you. So I think it's just a reality that we all work in one way or another with data. And across Oxfam, there are lots of blurry lines around when that becomes relevant to our programmes. So lots of people taking photos or using photos for communications reasons and those sorts of things. So we consider data to be photos, graphics, infographics, raw data, raw information, and some analysis that might have been conducted upon that analysis. And I was speaking with Sana yesterday about whether we mean big data, and I just want to sort of hint that that's quite ambitious for an organisation like Oxfam. We're not quite there yet when it comes to big data. We've explored some spaces, but more focusing on the pockets of research data and day-to-day data concepts. So increasingly, we really are relying on data in a lot of the work that we do to really ensure that we are responsive, accountable and transparent in the work that we do, and really make sure that we're responding to the needs of the communities with whom we work. And I think that this idea of an ethical methodology and ethics around the way that we interact with communities is nothing new. It's something that Oxfam's been, had in place for a very long time. I've got our very sort of most recent advice on research with ethical methodologies. We often twin with academic institutions to work with them around, passing methodologies through ethical boards. So that's not necessarily new. But what is new is the new digital realities that we're faced with and the new ways of working, which is leaving a lot of uncertainty and some question marks in a lot of practitioners' heads around what things we should be conscious of and what things we should have guidance around, minimum standards. So there's increasing storage on cloud-based servers, for example, and we're increasingly sharing our photographs and our data on Facebook, inviting interaction with groups that we work with. There's lots of these text messaging platforms, inviting people to contribute. And increasingly now we're looking at things like biometrics. So it's something that Oxfam hasn't done yet in terms of biometrics, because I'm sceptical about it. But I know groups like UNHCR, for example, have got Syrian refugees where they have to show a iris scan to get cash from an ATM, and that data is given to the Cairo American bank. But then if the Jordanian government requested that data, then they would have to give it up. So just acknowledging that ethical methodology is nothing new, but what I am talking about today is sort of the new changing realities and some of these new dilemmas that we face. So in many ways, we consider data and the opportunity that ICT can contribute to the data agenda to be a double-edged sword. So I love these cartoons. He goes, what should we do? His laptop's encrypted. We're never going to get through it. No good. It's 496-bit RSA. Oh, our plan's foiled. But then the reality is that they just bash him over the head until he gives them the password, and then you can break through. So it's just really this idea that it is a double-edged sword. ICTs can offer us really great new opportunities to better encrypt data. Having that data stored on a cloud server may well be much more better protected and better backed up than random bits of paper in a country office, or program workers who type their data up into an Excel spreadsheet but don't password protect it. So in some respects, we can see ICTs encouraging us to adopt better practices when it comes to those uses of data. But then on the other hand, we just need to make sure that it's not a false sense of security, and we are conscious and aware of the risks, know how to mitigate those risks, and make informed decisions on the basis of those risks. So in that respect, we see it like a data tightrope, where I think you're all academics, so you're very conscious that data really can exercise a great deal of power. It can create power, it can redistribute or amplify or even disrupt power, and it can both reveal and unravel atrocities and draw attention to where there may be injustice, but it can also expose the vulnerable and the marginalised. So I think we have to be conscious that when we're collecting data, there's an inherent power imbalance around that, and we have to be conscious, I think, in this as in our role as an NGO, as an international NGO, our responsibility when it comes to the ownership and representation of that data. So there's this kind of decision-making process and dilemma around, well, if that's the case and there are risks, does that mean that we shouldn't collect that data at all? And what the trade-offs are when it comes to that. So while data has the promise of really enhancing the quality of our work, we really need to have this level of consciousness. So it kind of brings me to our responsible data policy, which I'd love you all to have a look at, and it's just a first step. But essentially one of the opening phrases in this policy is that we don't want the policy to be restrictive or discouraging, recognising the value that data can bring to our work. But rather we want to ensure that it's a recognition of risks so we can mitigate those risks and enable us to be more accountable and raise the voice of those communities with whom we work. So you have a look there. So what does this really mean? You know, it's all been very abstract to this point and we're all very conscious of this fact. So I thought just to bring it to life, I'd share a few potential harm stories and examples of harm stories that I've heard about either from other organisations or from the media. And I'd also be really intrigued if you've got some as well that you'd like to share. And for the very reason that they're harm stories, I might be a little bit cryptic when I'm talking about them. So do forgive me in that respect. So I've got 4 harm stories. Would love to hear if you've got any others too. The first one is this taxi picture here, which was about in 2004, where New York City actually released some data under a Freedom of Information request, which was about 192 million taxi trips and fares. There were lots and lots of information. They had made some attempt to separate out personally identifiable PII information from the data sets. And they used a encryption, a way of sort of separating those data sets called hashing. But for one reason or another, because of the amount of information that people were able to request, links were able to be made between those different data sets, and they could actually people could extrapolate from that information, license plate numbers, names of drivers, how much money each driver made, where they lived, and even things like whether celebrities had travelled with them or people had gone to strip clubs, it says here. So I think it's this idea that it's one thing to anonymise data, but it's another thing if those pieces can be put back together. And I think that we're potentially on the verge of that, if we don't get the practice right when it comes to the way we anonymise data, that could be a real risk. The bottom one here is just to represent money transfer. So I don't want to necessarily name any particular companies, but we're increasingly getting reports around the level of data that companies need to know from Oxfam and our partners around people's personal financial information and their names in order for them to benefit from certain transfer functionality. So in Somalia, for example, there's 1.3 billion dollars of money sent through remittances, through money transfer programs, but those are now really shutting down because of the comparison between lists of names and the number of people that are on certain US authority lists. And likewise in Lebanon, we were working with an organisation who were blocking individual transfers just because names had a correlation with people that were on a watch list or what have you. And a lot of the time people have very similar names and might even misspell their names when they have an English translation. So we are facing dilemmas around how much data should we be sharing, how should we be engaging the communities we work with around that decision-making process, and should it mean that they can't benefit from those ways of working at all, and what is our relationship when it comes to working with private sector? We've got very high ethical checks, but what does that mean in terms of our working relationship? The top one up here on the right is around health and personal information. So I'm not naming or shaming or anything, but there are some contexts where we've heard of particularly sensitive health information be shared on channels where it really shouldn't be, and be shared on channels where people's names, symptoms, whether they're pregnant or not, have been very much open for the taking. I think there's an increasing pressure on NGOs to be collaborative, share information, make sure that they're being joined up. But what do we set to risk when it comes to those information sharing, and who could be in danger? And the final one is just really around photos. We do have quite high standards when it comes to our public communications, but increasingly we have a lot of staff going out to the field, will take photos, quite happily put the picture of a young child on their Facebook page. We're looking increasingly at participatory techniques, which do have, levels of consent, informed consent. But again, the questions around, do people really recognise, is it really informed? Do people really recognise what will happen with those videos and photos and how traceable they are? And how much you can tell from a photo around someone's ethnicity and things like that. So I'll let you think, and if you have other stories, I'd love to hear them when we break out. But to go from that doom and gloom to something maybe a bit more positive, is that we're starting to see a lot more good practice when it comes to responsible treatment of data. I met a lady from Amnesty International who has been doing a study of individuals at risk, and they wanted to revisit some pictures of individuals at risk from 30 years ago. And she actually said, well, really, that's a reuse of data, and the original spirit in which we're using those photos has changed so significantly that I don't think we can use them until we go back and get reconsent. And it was really powerful because they had no idea who a lot of the people were. They didn't have names stored and things like that, but they actually ended up going back to communities, trying to trace down these individuals, and ended up getting a lot richer data by revisiting them, finding out where they were now, and being able to really get that reconsent process. So it was very powerful. On the right here is a picture from the Philippines, where after we responded to Typhoon Haiyan, we did a relocation survey with some communities who had been encouraged by the government to move 40 metres away from the coast. And we did a survey to ask about their perceptions of that. And what was fantastic was that instead of waiting a month to type up that information and then put it into a report and then get it back and say, this is the findings, because we did it on mobile phones, we actually got that information almost instantly. So after it went through an anonymisation process, we held a community consultation the next day, and were able to firstly sort of gauge the trends and say, is this reflective of your opinion? Is this true to the opinions that you were trying to express? And secondly, how do you want to use that data? So a lot of the individuals were making infographics and sharing on their Facebook pages and talking about particular requests that they would want to see from their government as a result of this. So it was a really powerful process because it was a lot less extractive than it has been in the past, and a lot more empowering. Not to say we're perfect, but I think that's a good practice in terms of the way we're looking at ownership of individuals over their data. And then the final picture is just a picture of a project in Mali, which was looking at gender-based violence. And it was just showing that I think a lot of people think that a picture tells 1,000 words, but I think that some of these pictures are just as powerful, and we don't need to get people's represent people's identities in order for photos to tell a story. So if you've had a chance to check out our responsible data policy, it's just been sent around. Essentially, the way that we approached this, and at the moment it's really just early days in a policy, but basically in terms of the black, what we were looking at was the whole journey of data through its life cycle, right from its pre-life in terms of designing the questions and the methodology, through collection and storage, then as you start to transmit or analyse those results and present them, and maybe even do something as a result of those results, and then what happens afterwards, when do you go about disposing of that data, what happens. And this is it's picking out some of the core questions that we've been having around those areas. So when we are collecting data, really ensuring that we have high standards for getting informed consent and making sure that consent genuinely is informed, making sure that we're culturally and contextually appropriate in our methodologies. I think a lot of NGOs really do capture more than they need to in terms of data, and that can put quite a heavy burden on communities. So how do we really look at not collecting excessive or unnecessary data when it comes to that idea of we need to be representing the communities who we are asking of that data, making sure that their voices are heard. I think that some elements of this are quite technical when it comes to levels of encryption, password protection, role-based administration, process of anonymisation, and weighing up security risks as we move into some of the more specific considerations around representation and how to make sure that we adopt that more empowering and less extractive methodology. So I think that what I hope this shows is that it's not just a technical thing, but it's responding to new technical realities. And we all make mistakes. And I think that at Oxfam we're trying to accept that those mistakes are, we're facing new realities. Not everybody knows the answer, but we just need to be able to acknowledge those, reduce risks and deal with it as we come across certain challenges or certain ways that data could be interpreted or get wrongly or get into the wrong hands. So essentially, we're going through a process at the moment where we've developed this policy, and we've been through consultation periods. Oxfam's such a big organisation; it involves so many different stakeholders, from research through campaigns, through direct engagement in our humanitarian department. And so, although we're seeking a bit more feedback at the moment, we're taking it to our executive directors in March 2015. So from there, we really hope that it's not just going to be a policy that goes into our green book, it's where we put all our policies, but increasingly how we respond to the needs and the guidance of the staff that need to actually turn this into a reality. So I'm really keen, I know I've been speaking a lot with Virginia and with Sana, to use this opportunity just to share a bit where our thinking's at and kind of ask some core questions, which is, I'm sure that there are ways that we could come together to tackle some of these emerging privacy and security challenges, some of the new realities when it comes to that effective management of data. I'm all for not reinventing wheels, so I'm actually trying to convene a number of large NGOs around this issue so we can actually think about developing those resources together. We've got a partnership with Internews and are developing out some very specific resources around really raising awareness of the importance of this stuff. And so really it's about what can we learn from one another and what does the future look like in terms of that support and overlap with the academic community and your ways of working. So thanks so much for your attention, and I really look forward to the discussion and to hear what Sana has to say.
We'll just quickly switch over the presentation. So yeah, as he was introducing in the beginning, I'm Sanna and I work with the OII and have been talking with Amy a little bit earlier and hoping to have a really interesting discussion afterwards. I'm just gonna show a little bit of the academic viewpoint. Don't really have any specific answers, unfortunately, to offer to your policy, but hoping to maybe in a little bit different way to frame some of the considerations or questions that might be helpful to think about these issues. So just quickly go over the outline. I'll be brief, but initially just talk about some of the more practical issues with data, and then go over to the more interesting questions of exactly how the digital landscape has changed these ways of working and what are kind of the issues that we have been facing, especially at OII, and how we are sort of starting to think about them and deal with them. Let's skip over that. So if you are just looking at sort of the green highlights, that will be some of the more interesting things to pick out, just in response to how Oxfam is defining the responsible data policy. Normally we always also have our principle of research will do no harm, and the key contexts are very similar: informed consent, right to withdraw, and confidentiality. But of course, I think in the major difference between your work and ours is that we probably are dealing with much more controlled research contexts, because once we have a very difficult place where we would want to do research, our ethics board is just going to say, drop the project, maybe there's going to be another more applicable context to do it. So that's a key difference. So the tightrope is maybe a bit tighter for you in that sense, unfortunately. Data Protection Act is applying to all of the identifiable data, which is actually going to be switching over to a data protection regulation that is kind of over EU umbrella framework, whereas this one has been sort of applying to UK before. But also anonymized data, where it can be dealt with a little bit differently. It's still really important to keep it very confidentially and safely. Just to point out of the electronic storage formats, you mentioned the cloud-based platforms. So it's really interesting actually to deal with those, because many times when you are collecting data on those platforms, you might be located in one country, but you don't really know exactly where the data is stored. So that also might open some cases of consideration between the different regulatory frameworks in countries. And your data lifeline was really interesting to see. I think another important consideration would be to think about the skills and resource constraints that you might have in terms of staff, because it would be great to encrypt a lot of data and it will help us work better, but it's also important to know whether our offices in the UK or in other countries are able to sort of deal with that data and still keep their normal pace of work in the office. And so then to talk a little bit more about data ownership, and I'm having some examples in italics that I'll be addressing after. Sorry about the block of text, but I hope you can bear with me. So ultimately, of course, data belongs to individuals that have the right to withhold consent and remove the data when necessary. But in practice, it is really not so straightforward many times. I think a useful concept for the data policy might be the secondary data rights. Sort of how does the data collected and analyzed impact those that actually give the data onward? Because again, development context is a little bit different from research context. But I'm sure that you have a lot of stakeholder analysis in place that sort of helps to see those power dynamics especially, that might affect how written or verbal consent is given and how the beneficiaries or research subjects might feel comfortable about that in different ways. It's really important to consider the principle of informed consent realistically in changing contexts. Because, for example, in biobanks and cancer registries, when you are giving data, you normally sign on to have sort of an automatic reconsent, because the data can be used for different purposes by the organization, which is still within an umbrella of sort of a field of study that you would be agreeing to as a person who gives the data. But for example, recently there has been legislation that seems to be sort of banning this, and it will be quite difficult for the cancer registries then to work with that, for example. If you're interested in it, Brent will have a lot more to talk about it later on. And also the representativeness of digitally collected data, not only in terms of whether the people that actually hold the technology are representative of the entire population, but what other restrictions the technology might have in terms of maybe age restrictions of use or just the ways that it is used. I'm sure that you are considering that, but that might impact a lot the way in which you are looking your data and analyzing that. I know you said that you are not going to be using big data too much, but it's kind of in the horizon. So maybe just to touch on a couple of points that we have found to be quite important to consider, is that while the science and health industry have already large bodies of legislation dealing with big data, the tech industry is a little bit less in terms of guidelines for that sort of data. So it's oftentimes quite difficult to individually opting out from these contexts. And especially also when you have these types of platforms in which you can combine data sets and you can quite almost in real time see where a person is moving or what are their actions. And it might be a very, very different sort of landscape for an individual that is finding themselves in that context. And also just the context in which the data has been collected has to be treated with a lot of transparency, we find. Because many times since data has become really a business of many people recently, it can be collected for a very different purpose that is subsequently used for, and that might really kind of shift the consent that could have been given for the initial data set. So even universities have different practices concerning this, because in one university you might be able to use Twitter data from sort of the public domain, but another university might want you to actually seek for consent from each Twitter user to make sure that they are fine with their data being used. So there are, I think there is an ongoing discussion in terms of that. And then to talk a little bit more about open data and privacy, because you mentioned that you were especially interested in sort of open data and how it transfers with privacy. So whenever there is accessible data that might be in a format that sort of implies some level of difficulty, like browsing individual files on the internet, and once you turn that into a more kind of collated viewpoint, like a map, points in a map, it might really sort of shift the balance of privacy. So that's an important consideration for us. And whenever open data is discussed, it's always, or very often times, a discussion between should the data be open or not. But it's also about in which way the open data is actually released, because normally there is always some level of moderation and alteration into data sets just in terms of accuracy and correcting errors. So that's another important consideration of how exactly is the data released to be open. And privacy laws are really, privacy laws that concern abuse rather than access seem to be an area that is recently developing, but that can be quite problematic because the data and harm from its use can quite easily transfer between country borders that have different jurisdictions and also different privacy laws. And many countries might have actually quite little legislation concerning that. So that has been important for us to kind of acknowledge that there are quite some differences, as well as in practices just between developing and developed countries in terms of both open data and privacy considerations. So I think many people feel that there is a need for a clearer picture about the impacts of open data in order to sort of continue debating about the trade-offs between privacy and open data. So just to pull this together before we open it for the Q&A, I thought that some of the sort of takeaway considerations from just thinking about this and your presentations is that the same debates about principles of identification of data, informed consent, and appropriate methods are still really central ethical considerations in the new sort of context of digital data. And we totally agree with you that collaboration and knowledge exchange between practitioners and academia is definitely going to be very, very helpful in keeping up with the with the rapidly changing landscape. I just had a really funny discussion with a colleague that is working at the ethics board in the university, because I consulted him on this, like what exactly are sort of the latest guidelines for me as a researcher to deal with these kinds of topics. And he was saying like, it's gonna be me, because I'm the only person in the board who is actually kind of bringing these topics to life and starting to address them. So it is also kind of like very, very developing field, I feel, for many universities. So it's great that kind of people that are dealing with on a day-to-day basis are starting to develop that knowledge and formalize it and put it into policies as you are doing. Also something that could be helpful, I don't know if for the policy, but at least for your guidelines, is to distinguish between types of data so that you can kind of focus these discussions about responsibility a bit clearer, because there's a lot of very interesting viewpoints, but it will be always much clearer and more concrete when you talk about a specific type of data. And I think that it's good to keep in mind the skill and resource constraints when you are planning the policy, since you work in a lot of different countries. So I'm sure that you're also familiar with this too.
I have to write it, yeah.
Just something that might be useful. And I hope this is going to work as a gateway to an interesting discussion. We have a lot of very talented people around the table that I'm sure already have tons of questions and comments in their minds.
Thanks a lot, Sanna. Thanks, Amy.